Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for a cultural and, well, a culinary journey.
Absolutely.
We're focusing on 5 of the most universally adored dishes on the planet. Sushi, ramen, tempura, tonkatsu, and okonomiyaki.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. Now, you might think you know these dishes, you've had them, maybe you order them weekly.
Of course.
But the sources you've laid out tell a story that's completely different from the, refined, often expensive versions we see today. The history here is, well, it's messy, it's surprising, and it's absolutely rooted in necessity.
That's the core of it.
So our mission in this deep dive is pretty straightforward. Uncover the true, often humble origins of these staples. We want to understand how things like scarcity, foreign influence, and just the sheer speed of city life created this cuisine we all love.
And what's fascinating right from the start is the framework these historical sources give us. These dishes are not relics from some feudal lord's table.
Right.
They didn't emerge from royal kitchens. Instead, they almost always came from a place of laxo scarcity or from intense external interaction, which brought in new techniques, or simply from the brutal speed of urbanization.
It's a kind of pressure cooker.
It really is. And it highlights this incredible Japanese skill to take a concept, simplify it, and then apply this amazing discipline to balance and refine it. They turn necessity into art.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the most recognized dish, the one whose origin story is maybe the most shocking. I'm talking about sushi.
Of course.
When we think of sushi, we think pristine, precise, a delicate balance. It's the definition of high-end food. But where did it really begin? I keep coming back to this fact from the sources. It wasn't in Japan at all.
No, not originally. That's the critical point. We have to rewind nearly 1,000 years and look far beyond Japan into Southeast Asia for its roots.
Southeast Asia. Okay.
So the earliest form was called narazushi, and it was purely a preservation technique. I mean, this was vital before refrigeration.
Right.
The process involved fermenting fish and rice together for months. The starch in the rice creates lactic acid, which it basically pickles the fish.
And here's the wild part.
And here's that mind-bending nugget. When it was time to eat, the rice was always discarded.
Always. I can't wrap my head around that. For us, the vinegared rice, the sherry is everything.
But back then, it was just a fermentation tool, like the brine for pickles or a starter for sourdough. You just threw it away.
That is such a dramatic shift. But the birth of the sushi we know, the handheld snack, that happens much later. In Edo, right, the city we now call Tokyo.
It was pure congestion and commerce. The Edo period saw the city just swell into one of the biggest in the world.
And people needed to eat quickly.
They couldn't wait months for fermentation. They didn't have the space. So this need for speed drove the invention of hayazushi fast sushi.
Just sushi.
They drastically shortened the fermentation, and crucially, they started adding rice vinegar to the rice.
Ah, there it is. The vinegar.
That step was revolutionary. It gave you that sour tang of fermentation, and it made the food safe to eat instantly.
So the nigirizushi, the little hand-pressed piece we eat today, was born out of a need for instant gratification in a packed city. It was street food.
Exactly. The original fast food of Tokyo. Its journey from preservation to street snack to luxury dining.
Yeah.
It's a perfect microcosm of how urbanization changes everything.
That's powerful. Okay, let's shift to our second theme, external interaction. If sushi was shaped by internal urban pressure, our next 2 dishes were born from immigration and foreign contact. Let's start with ramen.
Ramen is the clearest case of this. The sources are unanimous. Ramen came directly from China.
No question about it.
None. It was sold as a simple wheat noodle soup by Chinese immigrants in port cities around the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
So it starts as this regional Chinese food, but when does it become so? So Japanese. I mean, today everyone thinks ramen is Japanese comfort food.
That pivot happens after a major global crisis. It ties right back to our theme of necessity. Post-World War II, the economy was in ruins.
Right.
And crucially, Japan received a huge influx of U.S. wheat aid. So suddenly, cheap flour was everywhere.
Ah, I see it now. You got cheap wheat for noodles. You've got millions moving to cities for factory work.
And those workers needed cheap, filling, hot calories fast.
And ramen was the perfect answer.
Precisely. It exploded. It was calorically dense, warm, affordable. It became the quintessential worker's meal. Its identity was forged not in a Chinese kitchen, but in post-war economic desperation, using foreign aid ingredients.
And that evolution just keeps going, right, with all the regional styles.
It never stopped. That's why we have the rich tonkatsu pork bone broth in Hakata, or the miso style in Sapporo, or the lighter shoyu in Tokyo. It just keeps adapting.
That's a fantastic transition. Now, tempura. This dish feels so inherently Japanese, that light, crispy batter.
But the technique is distinctly Portuguese.
Portuguese.
It was introduced in the 16th century by Jesuit missionaries in Nagasaki, and they weren't using the delicate technique we know today. It was a very simple frying method, just coating fish or vegetables in flour and water.
And the name. I read the sources on this, and it's fascinating.
Yes, the name tempura is widely believed to come from the Latin quattuor tempora,
Which means
the ember days. These were quarterly periods of fasting in the Catholic calendar where you couldn't eat meat, so the missionaries ate fried fish and vegetables instead.
a Japanese staple owes its name to a Catholic fasting ritual. That's the kind of thing that makes this deep dive so interesting.
But the genius was the refinement. The Japanese took this simple frying method and they elevated it completely.
How did they do that?
They lightened the batter, making it delicate and lacy, often by using ice-cold water to stop gluten from developing.
That's the secret.
And they meticulously refined the oil. They used lighter, cleaner oils, controlled the temperature perfectly, and like sushi, it became a star of the Edo street stalls, sold on skewers.
Incredible. So we've covered city speed and foreign influence. Now let's move to our third theme, Western adaptation, embodied by tonkatsu.
Right.
Today, tonkatsu is one of the ultimate comfort foods, that crispy breaded pork cutlet. It feels timeless, but it's a pretty modern invention.
Extremely modern. To understand tonkatsu, you have to look at the Meiji Restoration in 1868. This was Japan's intentional opening to the West, a national push for modernization.
And part of that was diet.
A huge part. The government actively started encouraging meat consumption, which had been restricted for centuries.
So they basically said, we're modernizing, we need to eat more meat. And they looked abroad for ideas.
They look straight to France. The technique of breading and frying a slice of meat is a direct adaptation of the French dish, the côtelette, the cutlet.
But they didn't just copy it.
Never. They localized it immediately. They favored ton, which is pork, because it was more available and cheaper, and they developed that signature coarse panko breading for maximum crunch.
But the real genius, again, is the presentation. The balance.
That's the critical element. They turned a French technique into a balanced Japanese meal. They serve it with that huge amount of shredded cabbage as a palate cleanser and with rice.
And the sauce.
Even the sauce, often based on imported Worcestershire sauce, was adapted to be sweeter and richer. It wasn't just fried meat, it was a carefully constructed meal.
And it worked. The sources say tonkatsu is now a fundamental part of the modern Japanese home kitchen.
A true success story of adaptation.
Finally, let's turn to the dish that's maybe most defined by pure necessity, okonomiyaki. The name itself is the whole story.
It is. It literally translates to cook as you like.
What you like grilled.
Right. It's a dish defined by using whatever you have on hand. Its modern form, that dense, savory pancake, was really cemented by the extreme scarcity after World War II.
So it connects right back to that theme of lack. Post-war scarcity must have been the turning point.
Absolutely. When ingredients were scarce, flour and cheap cabbage were the only reliable staples. Okonomiyaki was the perfect vehicle.
You could just mix everything together.
You mix the flour and cabbage with whatever scraps you could find, bits of protein, vegetables, noodles. It was sustenance born from the need to be cheap and filling.
It's culinary resilience.
It is, and it retains that identity as a true folk food, a working-class meal. That's why you have these intense debates over regional styles.
Like the Osaka versus Hiroshima style.
Exactly. Osaka style mixes everything together. It's quicker. Hiroshima style is layered crepe, then cabbage, then noodles, then egg, a more complex process. Both are masterpieces of cooking with what you have.
So if we connect all these dots, the source material paints a really clear picture. The dishes the world loves most are not ancient, unchanging traditions.
Not at all. They're defined by adaptation, by necessity, by the pace of city life.
It's proof that cuisine is a living historical document. It reflects this profound Japanese mastery of adaptation, simplification, and balance.
They take a foreign technique or respond to a crisis, and through incredible discipline, they elevate that basic necessity into a global art form.
So what does this all mean for you listening at home? It means every bite you take is a chapter of economic and social history. The cuisine isn't static, it's always evolving.
And this raises an important question for you to consider. While so many of these dishes started out as cheap street food, it's the level of refinement and almost spiritual discipline applied to them now that elevates them.
That's a powerful final thought. How many of the world's haute cuisine items originated not in palaces, but out of absolute necessity or foreign influence? When you approach your next meal, look for that hidden history, the struggle baked into the very first recipe.
It changes how you taste the dish.
Thank you for diving deep with us. We will catch you next time.